On the 9th of January 2024, 208 members of South Korea's National Assembly stood almost as one, voting unanimously to outlaw something their grandparents had eaten without a second thought. Parliament passed a law to end the breeding, slaughter, and sale of dogs for meat, a practice woven into the country for centuries with a 3-year window before it takes full effect. Not a single vote opposed it. And yet, on that same day, in a handful of rural counties in southern China, where dog meat has survived as a local specialty for generations, defended by some residents and quietly opposed by many others nearby, a vendor was doing business as usual in a trade most of the country doesn't practice and increasingly disapproves of. Two governments, two neighborhoods, two entirely different relationships with the same animal, existing at the very same moment in history. That contradiction sits at the heart of something stranger than it first appears. Because the line separating pet from protein isn't drawn by biology, it isn't drawn by intelligence, loyalty, or how an animal is raised. It's drawn by culture. And culture, it turns out, can move that line wherever it pleases. This isn't really a story about dogs. It's a story about us, why the same species can be sacred in one kitchen and simmering in a pot a few streets away, and why that boundary, once you look closely, is far less stable than anyone assumes. Picture two animals raised almost identically, fed by hand, given names, allowed to sleep indoors. One will live 12 years and be buried with grief. The other will end its life on a plate, and the household eating it will feel no more conflict than someone carving a chicken. Stand between those two homes and the dog itself hasn't changed. What's changed is an invisible agreement, passed down for generations, about which animals count as kin and which count as food. Humans have kept that agreement with astonishing consistency and astonishing inconsistency, sometimes within the same culture, sometimes within the same decade. To understand why, you have to go back further than any cuisine, back to the very start of the relationship between humans and dogs. Genetic evidence suggests dogs were the first animal humans ever domesticated, splitting from wolves somewhere between roughly 15,000 and possibly more than 30,000 years ago, a range scientists still argue over. Long before livestock, before agriculture, there was a wolf at the edge of a human fire, tolerated for what it offered: warning, warmth, help hunting. That early bond should have settled the question forever. It didn't. As human societies diverged, as some built temples and others built empires, as some faced famine and others harvested surplus, the same animal was pulled in opposite directions. In Mesoamerica, Spanish chroniclers working alongside Aztec informants documented a hairless breed, the Xoloitzcuintli, raised both as companions and, in specific ritual contexts, as food, believed to guide the dead through the underworld. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, European voyagers who reached Polynesia in the 18th century recorded island communities raising dogs on a starch-heavy, largely vegetarian diet purely for meat, kept in the same villages as dogs treated purely as companions, two categories coexisting without confusion. These weren't cultures that failed to notice a dog's intelligence or affection. They noticed. They simply organized that intelligence into a different social role than the one much of the modern West now assumes is universal. Here's where the investigation gets genuinely surprising. The deciding factor across history wasn't cruelty, and it wasn't ignorance, it was arithmetic. The anthropologist Marvin Harris spent decades asking why cultures eat what they eat, and his answer was strikingly unromantic. Food traditions tend to track ecological and economic pressure, not sentiment. An animal that earns its keep alive, pulling a cart, guarding a flock, herding livestock becomes economically foolish to slaughter. An animal that offers little labor value, but breeds quickly and needs little land, becomes a rational source of protein in places where cattle or pigs are scarce or expensive to raise. In much of Europe and the pastoral world, dogs worked. In parts of East Asia and the Pacific, where large grazing animals were harder to keep, dogs sometimes filled a dietary gap that cows and pigs filled elsewhere. That single insight reframes almost everything that follows, because it means the family versus food divide was never really about how lovable a dog is. It was about what else was available to eat, and what a society needed that animal to do while it was alive. Which raises an uncomfortable question the documentary hasn't answered yet. If the divide is just economics dressed up as sentiment, why does it provoke such fury today? The human story here is where things stop being abstract. In South Korea, the animals raised for meat were for decades largely a separate population from household pets, bred on farms. Often a breed sometimes called Nurungi, rarely kept indoors, that distinction mattered enormously to older generations who grew up associating the Dishboshentang with folk beliefs about stamina and health during summer heat. But as South Korea urbanized at extraordinary speed through the late 20th century, dogs increasingly moved indoors, into apartments, into families, into the emotional category pet. And a whole generation grew up unable to reconcile the two roles the previous generation had kept separate without difficulty. Surveys commissioned by the animal welfare organization Humane World for Animals found the vast majority of South Koreans, roughly 86%, now personally reject eating dog meat, not because a law told them to, but because the culture had already moved before the law caught up. That's the twist worth sitting with. The ban didn't create the shift in feeling. The shift in feeling created the ban. Something similar, though far less complete, has been happening in China. The dog meat trade there is not a national cuisine. It's a shrinking, regionally concentrated practice, most visible each summer at a lychee and dog meat festival in Yulin, a city in Guangxi province, which draws international condemnation and notably domestic Chinese opposition too. Animal welfare investigators have repeatedly documented trucks carrying dogs toward Yulin's slaughterhouses that turn out to be stolen pets and unregistered strays rather than animals raised for meat at all, a pattern independently reported by journalists at the scene as well as by activists themselves. That's a genuine wow moment buried in the investigation. Much of the controversy isn't really family versus food as a clean cultural divide. It's a black market economy quietly consuming the very pets it's supposedly separate from. Set against all that is the legend that refuses to die, the claim that dog meat carries special medicinal power, boosting virility or stamina, particularly in hot weather. Traditional medicines authorities in Vietnam, one of the region's other dog-eating countries, have formally stated that dog meat holds no genuine curative role for joint health, bone health, or virility, and no credible clinical evidence anywhere supports the claim. The belief persists not because of biology, but because of folk medicine traditions that assign symbolic properties to foods eaten in specific seasons. A pattern found in food cultures worldwide, from believed cooling and heating foods in East Asian medicine to European humoral theory centuries earlier. Understanding why the myth took hold rather than mocking those who believed it is part of understanding the whole picture. Zoom out further and the pattern becomes bigger than dogs entirely. Nearly every culture on Earth draws an arbitrary line around which animals are edible and which are unthinkable to eat. Cattle in India, pigs across much of the Islamic and Jewish world, horses in Britain and the United States, insects across most of the West. None of these lines map onto intelligence, capacity to suffer, or biology in any consistent way. They map onto history, religion, ecology, and identity. Dogs simply sit closer to home for more people than any other animal on that list, which is precisely why this particular line generates more raw emotion, more international headlines, and more moral certainty than almost any other food taboo on the planet. Which brings the story back to where it began, to two households, two animals, one invisible agreement passed down without either family ever quite deciding to write it. South Korea's ban didn't resolve that agreement. It simply confirmed which side of it an entire nation had already quietly chosen. Somewhere else, that choice is still being made, one generation at a time, the same way it always has been, not by law and not by biology, but by the slow, unspoken arithmetic of what a society decides an animal is for. The dog hasn't changed at all. We have, and the question worth carrying out of this story isn't which culture got it right. It's how much of what any of us consider unthinkable to eat is really just an accident of where, and when, we happen to be born.